Hello and welcome. Today I'll take you through a whole year of experimenting with dyeing with local plants and mushrooms. I'll show you all my fails and successes, and hopefully I can inspire you to try it out for yourself. But first, let's get some disclaimers out of the way. You need to do a bit of research about your local plants, find out which one you can pick and which should be left alone. Get your information from reputable sources and don't pick something you don't know. Be mindful, don't overpick native plants and avoid spreading invasive ones. To avoid confusion, I will have the Latin name of the plants I'm using on screen and in the description below. With that out of the way, let's start prepping. I will be using wool as it is the easiest to dye with. The method used in this video only works for wools and silks. To make the dye stick to the yarn, it usually needs some help. I'm using a alum mordant. This will help with the longevity and brightness of the color. I used 18% alum, meaning 18 grams per 100 grams of wool. It dissolves in water once it reaches 40 degrees, then I pour it into my larger vessel, holding the same temperature. I add my pre-soaked wool and let it simmer for about 85 degrees for 1 hour. The yarn is left in a cooling water overnight. Since the water's pH and metals can change the color, it's recommended to use a steel casserole throughout the entire process. Yellow is the easiest color to achieve, and most plants have yellow pigments in them. A rule of thumb is to use 4 times as much plant material as yarn. I picked my flowers and let them rest outside so the bugs could escape. Then I boiled them for 1 hour before adding my yarn. The tansy gets a 7 out of 10 on smell. It smells like you forgot a lemon cake in the oven. It's good practice to use invasive plants. I picked these at work, but where I live there was only the native variety. My mother saw the color and said she would like something made with it. I picked 600 grams of flowers and dyed 200 grams of yarn, and hopefully I will be able to weave a gift using the yarn before Easter. This next one is known as Icelandic moss, but technically it's a lichen. And since it's so lightweight, you have to gather a lot of it to create a dye. It gave a somewhat unimpressive pale yellow, and I think there are better plants out there for this color. Lichens grow slowly, and it's bad practice to pick anything that hasn't fallen on the ground. A large area of the woods had recently been turned into lumber, leaving the branches behind. This gave me the opportunity to gather large amounts of this type of lichen. I don't know which type, but I know it as tree beard. I did a test and it came out bright orange. I also added some iron to see how it would change, which it didn't. I collected 300 grams of beard over several walks and used it to dye 100 grams of yarn. It gave me a warm yellow, but nowhere near the same orange. After even more walks, I had 300 grams more. This time I put it into a nylon stocking because it had been nearly impossible to get a lichen out of the yarn before. And after an hour I had, if not orange, then the warmest of yellows. The most common way to achieve green is to add iron. You can use an iron pot, add iron supplements or rusted metal directly into the pot, or make iron vitriol by leaving rusted metal in a mix of water and vinegar. It's ready to use once the water looks like this. Adding it to yellow dye will turn it green. This one gets a 10 out of 10 for the smell. It's floral and sweet like an expensive perfume. I like the green I got from this plant, but I was unable to find more of it. Instead, I used the white variety and a second method to achieve green, which is to dye grey yarn yellow. This plant even dyed the cotton string. There are plants that will give you true green, and different plants will give you different tones. I know St. John's wort is commonly used, but I didn't have time to try it this year. Red is one of the colors that are most difficult to achieve with natural dye. Historically, madder was used, but it's not the only plant. If you've ever made tea with St. John's wort, you've seen how it dyes the water red. The flowers contain a pigment, which, if used correctly, can be used as a dye. I picked only flower buds and dried them until I had enough material. The trick to achieving red with plants is to use a low temperature. I also wanted to try the fermentation process, where you leave plant matter in a jar with water and ammonia for at least a month to cure. To be thorough, I also tried one with vinegar. The ammonia one turned red within an hour. At 50 degrees, I didn't get any color, and I didn't until I turned it up to 70. The test yarn turned purple, and 6 months later, it still is, but I don't think it will hold up over time. The one I pickled didn't change color, and it gave me a tea-colored yarn, but into my fermented bath, I added more dried flowers. I kept it at 70 and it turned brown, and as a last effort, I turned up the heat to boiling just to see what I would get. Dark brown with faint purple and green hues. In my local plant group, there is this legend of how you can get red dye from oregano flowers. This is because it says so in a respected book on plant dyes, but unlike St. John's wort, people doesn't truly believe it. I tried different temperatures and fermenting, but all I got was a weak tea color. I've seen people achieve all sorts of colors with this plant, and seeing that it's a common weed, I didn't have to go far to find it. The seeds gave me the most beautiful warm ochre. Adding ammonia didn't change the color, but since I liked it so much, I strained the water and added a different type of yarn, and this turned brown. The more commonly used part of the plant are the roots. I rinsed them, and to achieve the most color, you need to let them rest in the sun for a few hours, and they'll turn yellow. It had been raining for 2 months. Next, I wanted to try and ferment it, and I did make one with vinegar too, for science. 6 weeks later, it looks like this. I ended up with the boring pale brown. Adding iron also didn't change it, and the pickled one became yellow. Next plant I wanted to try was oak. I have a large tree growing in my yard and I wanted to see what colours I could get. The fresh leaves with the stems still attached only gave a pale, milky yellow, and it was only later that I learned that the leaves are commonly used with iron to make grey. For this I used fallen leaves. I didn't do the best job of cleaning out the stems and nuts, and this most likely affected my colour. After an hour of simmering, I dumped out most of the leaves and added not a small amount of the iron. When the colour didn't change, I added some ammonia to neutralise the pH after adding the iron and vinegar mix. When I tested this with better rinsed leaves, but also different yarn, I got grey, so I guess I'll have to try this again come summer. Next up, we're trying the nuts. This is what's left after the squirrels. The colour I got was a somewhat undecided pink-orange and reminded me the most of the skin colour that came in an old box of Crayolas in the 70s. I'm not that old, but I used them when I visited my grandma. I tried to find the English word for this thing that attaches the fruit to the tree, but I couldn't find one, and now I'm convinced that you don't have one. Like, what do you call the leaves on a strawberry? Because I would call both of these things humps. I think it's the vinegar in the iron mix that made the yellow pale in the last test. I wanted to be able to weave using only colours from oak, and thus I had to go out and find trees with more nuts. The woody part of the trees, like nuts, bark and pine cone, have natural tannins in them which work as a mordant. They mostly give different shades of brown, but I didn't like the shades I had and wanted to try and spruce them up a bit. I tried first with 2 types of yarn and they turned a nice golden brown. I then re-dyed one of my previous attempts and let it simmer for 1 hour, same as the others. Here is the before and here is the after. Not wildly different, but the colour is a bit more saturated and a little warmer. I'm not gonna bother with the fancy name for this one, they're black beans. I didn't like them and tried to find another use for them. After soaking them overnight, they were ready to use. This was one of the first attempts I made, but it doesn't look that different from the previous one. The other colour that is near impossible to get is blue. We commonly use woad or indigo, none of which I can forage for, but as you can see, we are moving over to the mushroom part of the video. This guy right here grows in spruce forests, and supposedly it will give you brown, while their pine cousin will give you green or blue. My test became petrol grey. These mushrooms look identical, but like I said, grow under different trees. When I tried to look them up for this video, it looks like the first one is found in Europe and North America, but the pine variety is only found vaguely in Northern Europe. The acidity in the soil is what gives these mushrooms the different dyes, and so I wonder if you would get different colours from the ones overseas. It doesn't show up well on camera, but my test turned out dark petrol blue, so naturally I dumped 100 grams of yarn into the pot, knowing that the ratio of yarn to mushrooms was too high. What I achieved was a pale grey, honestly the one I tried to get from the oak leaves. But I had gotten a glimpse of the blue that could have been, and I spent the next couple of weeks picking 10 kilos of them. The more rotten they are, the better, so I let them sit in the garage to ferment. This would have worked better had it been warmer, looking up the ratio in forums told me I needed 200 times fresh mushroom to yarn, meaning that my 10 kilos is enough for 50 grams. Since I couldn't fit all of it into my 10-liter pot, I cooked them in portions, boiled down the liquid and freeze them until use. I replaced the water and boiled each portion of mushrooms up to 3 times, and in the end I was left with a thick soup. Ugh. Okay, so in a lot of the recipes I found it said that you should have one yarn that picks up all of the brown color before you have your second wash, which is the blue. And the first one turned out completely brown, so let's see if this one turns out. I did let the first yarn rest in some water with vinegar in case it would help, and eventually rinsed it completely. And here are my definitely not blue yarns. It's not the fault of the mushroom or the quantity, but my method. Maybe I shouldn't have boiled each portion more than once, or maybe it boiled for too long. One day I walked outside to find this plant and its whole family in my backyard. I like to look up and read about new plants, and besides being toxic, the berries have been used for ink and the root apparently as dye. And this I had to try. This was yet another of my first attempts at dyeing yarn, and I used the berries to dye some superwash I had dug out of my stash. It's a strong grey colour, so naturally I wanted to dye something else, but it was a great disappointment when my expensive weaving yarn turned dishwater grey instead. This is an extremely diluted mix, but as you can see, it's not actually that potent. I also tried this part of the same plant, which is supposed to be the medicinal part. This was the same yarn, and I'm convinced it was the small bits of roots that gave it any colour. The roots was my first fermentation attempt, and it looked promising. I added vinegar to neutralise some of the pH from the ammonia in the jar, and added my test. It didn't take any colour until the water was boiling. The superwash again turned grey, but the weaving yarn is still more dishwater than I would like. I half-heartedly added some yarn, but it didn't take. I never tried the fresh roots, and at this point the plants had withered, so maybe it's worth trying next year. Red is a colour that is difficult to achieve, and apparently the most expensive colour back in the Viking era. We typically use madder for this. What I have here, which you might remember for when I tried to make green, is what I would like to call pauper's madder. It's a native plant, and the roots can, if treated correctly, make red. After cleaning, they should be stored for 3 to 12 months to dry. While we wait for that, I thought I would try and test what colour you get from a wilted plant contra a fresh one. I've seen people claim that you get some nice colours from autumn leaves, but my test only showed that you get less pigment. To achieve red, the number one rule is low temperature. The water should not be above 65 degrees, but I've seen others suggest 50. After a little more than 3 months, I did my best to remove all of the plant matter from the roots and not so carefully raise the temperature. After holding steady for 30 minutes, I leaned back only for the water to heat up more than it should. I did a test, and after a few minutes it turned orangey red, and I decided to throw in my yarn. It stayed orange, so I decided to leave it in the pot overnight, and the next morning it was pink. It doesn't show up on camera at all, but I decided to heat it up to see what would happen.
So I've just heated it up. And it turned back to orange. This is so weird.
After cooling down completely, it turned pink, and this was the final result. I would say the colour is like a tutti frutti coloured ice cream, much more red than the fleshy Crayola, but still not a true red, and that is most likely because I heated it too much. This group of mushrooms are commonly used for their strong pigments, that being mostly yellow and red. I'll list the different mushrooms in the description, but since I can't fully determine them, I suggest you look it up for yourself and don't trust the word of an amateur. The way to test if and what pigment you can use from different mushrooms, you simply pour boiling water over them and see. I also chose to do a test thread, but this method doesn't give you a good test. I'd recommend that you instead boil them for that. Even if this was a wonderful mushroom year, I couldn't find that many. It might have to do with the whole deforestation thing, but I managed to collect and dry 45 grams of red hats from different species, and I've heard people achieve colour with much less. You'll also get different colours from the hat, stem and the whole mushroom. My test died within just a few minutes and I added 50 grams of yarn. At this point, I thought it would be wise to test how the pH would affect the colour and set my test aside. Looking at the test, I decided to add ammonia to the bath. After 15 minutes I was happy with the colour and moved the yarn to finish its boil in another pot. Not thinking there was much dye left, I added some knitting yarn. At this point I decided to look at my test yarn and added vinegar to both pots. I'm now more or less neutralising the pH of the first yarn. The vinegar makes it pink and the ammonia makes it orange. I kept adding more and more yarn to the pot and there was still colour left. Eventually I threw in the red stems. This is how the first bath turned out. Here is the second, and the third in awful lighting. After trying to put some yellow yarn in the pot and deciding that it looked best on white yarn, I then added another 100 grams of yarn for the fourth bath, which means that my 45 grams of dried mushroom was enough for about 200 grams of yarn. I was hoping for orange and added the yellow stems as well. And here are my reds. And here are my reds together with a store-bought red yarn. I did lastly decide to throw in another failed attempt at the end. There wasn't much colour left, but I still ended up with a dusty pink. And that was the whole year. And as the world is currently covered in snow, it's time to hibernate and wait for spring to come. Until next time.